He thought he was testing a maid, but in less than 60 seconds, the entire room would realize he had just exposed himself instead. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble as the elite of Seoul gathered inside Kang Ji-hyun's private penthouse, 30 floors above the Han River, where power didn't need to be announced. It was simply understood. Conversations flowed in low, confident tones, tailored suits brushed against silk dresses, and every movement carried the quiet weight of wealth measured not in dollars, but in control. And at the center of it all stood Jae-hyun himself, calm, composed, his dark eyes scanning the room like a man who owned not just the space, but the people inside it. And tonight he was in a particular mood, the kind that turned curiosity into a test, and a test into something far more dangerous. A financial projection glowed softly on the massive screen behind him. Numbers cascading in neat, precise columns, percentages, risk margins, projected returns over 5 years. The kind of data that made executives lean forward and speak carefully, because one wrong answer in this room didn't just cost credibility. It could cost opportunity, influence, access. So, Jae-hyun said, his voice smooth, almost casual, yet cut clean through the room like glass. Who here can tell me what's wrong with this model? A few men exchanged glances. A woman in a navy suit shifted slightly. Someone cleared their throat, but no one spoke because they all knew better. This wasn't a question, it was a trap dressed as one. And then, just as the silence began to stretch thin, he turned his head slightly, his gaze landing somewhere unexpected, somewhere beneath their notice. Near the edge of the room, beside a table lined with untouched champagne flutes, stood Mai, her hands wrapped around a simple white cloth, her posture straight but unassuming, dressed in a plain black uniform that blended into the background so completely she might as well have been part of the furniture, invisible by design, unnoticed by choice. And yet in that moment, every eye followed Jae-hyun's. A faint smile touched his lips, not warm, not kind, but deliberate. "What about you?" he said, tilting his head just enough to make it clear who he meant. "You've been standing there long enough. Tell us, what do you see?" The room reacted instantly, a ripple of quiet amusement. A few soft chuckles slipping past polished restraint, because to them, this wasn't a real question. It was entertainment, a brief distraction before business resumed. Someone murmured under their breath, "This should be good." Another leaned back, crossing his arms, already anticipating the awkward silence that would follow. But Mai didn't move right away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, not from fear, but from something harder to read, something quieter. And when she finally lifted her gaze, wasn't hesitant, wasn't searching. It was steady. She looked at the screen, really looked, her eyes tracing the numbers not like a stranger, but like someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. And for the briefest moment, something shifted, so subtle it almost went unnoticed, except by one person. Ji-hyun's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, just slightly, as if a thought had crossed his mind that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. And still, he said, nothing more, giving her space, or perhaps giving her enough rope to fail. The room leaned in, waiting, expecting, ready to dismiss whatever came next, because in their world, people like her didn't speak. They served, they cleaned, they disappeared. And yet, as the seconds passed, the silence grew heavier, not with mockery, but with something else entirely, something none of them had planned for, something none of them yet understood. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, and then long enough to become dangerous, because in a room like this, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was always noticed. A man near the window let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as he lifted his glass. "Come on, she does not even know what that model is." Another voice followed, softer but sharper. "Maybe explain it in simpler terms for her." The tone wrapped in politeness but dripping with dismissal. And still Mai did not react to them. Her attention remained fixed on the screen, on the columns of numbers that most people here only pretended to understand, her eyes moving slowly, deliberately, as if she were not being tested, but evaluating something for herself, something real. Kang Ji-hyun watched her closely now, no longer casually. There was a precision in his gaze, like a man adjusting focus on something that refused to stay in the background. Because this was not the reaction he expected, not the nervous glance, not the quiet apology, not the immediate surrender to the role everyone had already assigned her. And so he took one step forward, just enough to shift the energy in the room again. "Let me make it easier," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but this time there was intention behind it. "The projected return assumes a stable interest rate over 5 years. But the market does not stay stable. So tell me," he paused, just slightly, letting the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. "What happens if the rate shifts by 2% in year 3? This time, the room did not laugh. They leaned in, because now it sounded like a real question, a technical one, the kind that separated those who truly understood from those who simply followed. And still, the expectation remained the same. She would fail, gracefully or awkwardly, but she would fail. Mai lowered her gaze for a brief second, not in submission, but in thought, her fingers relaxing slightly around the cloth, her breathing steady. And when she looked back up, her voice came out. Quiet but clear, not rushed, not uncertain. "The model breaks," she said. The words landed so simply that for a moment, no one reacted, as if they had not heard her correctly. A man near the center frowned. "What do you mean it breaks?" he asked, almost impatient, as if correcting her would restore the balance of the room. But Mai did not look at him. She looked at the screen again, then back at Kang Jae-hyun, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that did not belong to a maid standing in a corner. It belonged to someone who understood consequence. "It assumes reinvestment at the same rate," she continued, her tone steady. "But if the rate increases, the cost of capital rises, and the projected return becomes inflated. The model shows profit, but in reality, it creates a loss." The room went still, not because they agreed, but because they were processing, recalculating, checking her words against their own understanding. And one of the senior analysts, a man, who had remained silent until now, shifted forward in his seat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked back at the numbers, his lips pressing together as if something did not sit right anymore. And Kang Jae-hyun did not move at all, his gaze locked on her, the faint trace of amusement that had been there before now completely gone, replaced by something sharper, something quieter, something that did not belong in a moment that was supposed to be nothing more than a joke. And yet, no one spoke because somewhere in that silence, a single thought began to take shape in every mind in the room. The possibility that the person they had just laughed at might be the only one who had actually seen the truth. The analyst did not speak right away, which in a room like this meant more than any immediate reaction ever could, because hesitation from someone of his level was not uncertainty. It was recalculation, and as his eyes moved across the projection again, slower this time, more deliberate, the faint crease forming between his brows told a story no one wanted to acknowledge yet. Someone shifted in their chair. Another set their glass down a little too carefully, and the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the room had suddenly realized it was no longer in control of its own narrative. "That is not correct." A voice finally broke through, sharp, defensive, belonging to a man standing near the edge of the screen, one of the junior executives who had been nodding confidently just moments ago. "The model accounts for fluctuations," he added quickly, his tone carrying the urgency of someone trying to restore order before it slipped too far. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered back to the numbers, just for a second, just enough to betray doubt. Mai did not respond immediately. She did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply stepped half a pace closer to the screen, careful, respectful, but no longer invisible, and lifted her hand slightly, not to point but to guide attention. "The adjustment is here," she said softly, her voice steady. "But it assumes the reinvestment rate remains proportional, which only works if the capital structure does not change." She paused, letting that settle, not forcing it, not pushing. "But if borrowing costs increase, the model compounds the error each quarter, so the profit you see at the end is not real." Silence followed again. But this time it was different, heavier, because now it was not just a possibility, it was a crack forming in something they had already accepted as truth. The senior analyst leaned forward further, his fingers pressing lightly against the table as if grounding himself, his eyes narrowing as he recalculated in real time, mentally adjusting variables, testing her claim against his own expertise, and then, almost imperceptibly, his posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Kang Jae-hyun to see. Jae-hyun's gaze flicked from the analyst back to Mai, and for the first time that evening, there was no trace of performance left in his expression, no calculated calm, no quiet amusement, only focus, sharp and unfiltered. "Check it," he said, his voice low, controlled, directed not at her, but at the analyst, and that single command carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. The analyst nodded once, already reaching for his tablet, fingers moving quickly, pulling up the model, adjusting the parameters, running the scenario she had described, and the seconds that followed felt longer than they should have, stretching thin under the pressure of expectation, because everyone in the room understood what was at stake now, not just the accuracy of a model, but the unspoken hierarchy that had just been challenged. A woman near the back folded her arms tighter, her eyes fixed on the screen. Another man leaned forward, no longer relaxed, no longer entertained. And through it all, Mai stood still, her hands now resting calmly at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in question for her. Then the analyst stopped typing, his hand hovering for a brief moment before he slowly exhaled, the sound barely audible, but in the silence it might as well have echoed, and when he looked up, his eyes met Ji-hyun's first, not the room, not the others, just him, and he gave the smallest nod, subtle, undeniable. "She is right," he said, his voice measured, professional, but carrying the weight of something far greater than a simple confirmation. And just like that, the room shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but completely, because in that single moment, the foundation of everything they had assumed, everything they had laughed at, everything they had dismissed, cracked open, and no one moved, no one spoke, because they all understood, without needing it said, that the person they had reduced to a joke had just seen what none of them had, and Kang Jae-hyun remained perfectly still, his eyes still on her, as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a maid standing at the edge of the room, but as something far more dangerous, far more rare, something that did not fit into any role he had prepared for tonight. No one laughed this time, not even out of habit, because the kind of silence that filled the room now did not allow it. It pressed down on every shoulder, every breath, forcing each person to sit inside the realization they had just witnessed. The man who had challenged her earlier looked away first, adjusting his cuff as if that small movement could restore some measure of control, but his fingers were not steady. And the woman in the navy suit, who had remained composed through countless high-stakes negotiations, now stared at the screen as if seeing it for the first time, her lips slightly parted, her confidence quietly unraveling. And at the center of it all, Kang Ji-hyun finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured precision that defined everything he did. He took a slow step toward Mai, closing the distance that had once felt like a boundary between two entirely different worlds. And as he stopped just a few feet from her, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, not for entertainment this time, but for judgment. "Look at me," he said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer distant. And for a brief second, the command lingered in the air, not as an order, but as an invitation to step into a space no one like her had been allowed to occupy before. Mai lifted her eyes to meet his, and there was no fear in them, no trace of the hesitation they had all expected earlier, only calm, steady clarity, the kind that does not come from confidence, but from certainty. Ji-hyun studied her face, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface, some explanation that would make this moment fit into the world he understood, but nothing about her aligned with the role he had assigned her just minutes ago. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, the question simple, but the weight behind it unmistakable, because this was no longer about the model, or the numbers, or the mistake. It was about her. A few heads turned, eager now. In a different way, not to mock, but to understand, to place her back into a category that made sense, because without that, The entire structure of the room felt unstable. Mai did not answer immediately. Her gaze did not drop, did not shift. She simply held his eyes for a moment longer, as if deciding how much of herself to reveal. And then she spoke, her voice as quiet as before. But now every person in the room leaned in to catch it. I used to build models like that, she said. The words did not land loudly. They did not need to, because their impact was not in volume, but in implication, and a reaction rippled through the room in subtle ways. A sharp inhale here, a slight shift there, the kind of movements people make when something does not fit the story they have already told themselves. Ji-hyun's expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes did, something that tightened, sharpened, recalibrated, as if a new equation had just replaced the old one that he had not anticipated, one that he now needed to solve. Used to, he repeated, his tone quieter now, not challenging, but probing because the past tense mattered. It suggested a fall, a choice, a story that did not belong in a uniform like hers. Mai gave the smallest nod, not defensive, not ashamed, just factual. Before, she said, and left it there. No explanation, no elaboration. Just a single word that carried more weight than any detailed answer could have, because it forced the room to confront what it could not immediately define. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the numbers, not in the screen, but in the balance of power itself, subtle but undeniable, because respect had entered the space where dismissal had lived just minutes before, and Kang Ji-hyun, the man who controlled everything in this room, stood facing the one person he had underestimated, realizing that whatever he thought he was testing tonight had turned into something else entirely. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, simple, unfinished, and yet impossible to ignore, because before demanded a story, and in a room built on control, unanswered questions were a kind of disruption no one was comfortable with. A man near the far end of the table let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff, as if trying to reclaim the tone from earlier. Everyone has a past, he muttered, but it did not carry the same weight this time. It did not land because no one was laughing anymore. No one was willing to reduce her back into something small now that they had seen what she could do. Kang Ji-hyun remained exactly where he stood, his attention fixed entirely on Mai. The rest of the room fading into the background in a way that rarely happened, because he was not a man easily distracted. But this was no longer distraction. This was calculation, the kind that happened when something valuable appeared where it should not have. You built models like that, he repeated, not questioning, but confirming, his voice quieter now, more focused. At what level? It was not a casual question. It was precise, designed to measure, to define, to place her within a hierarchy he understood. Mai did not hesitate this time. Not because she was eager to answer, but because the truth required no preparation. Institutional portfolios, she said, her tone even long-term risk strategies, and again, the reaction in the room was not loud. But it was undeniable, a shift in posture, in breathing, in attention, because that was not beginner language, that was not something learned casually or accidentally. That was the language of people who sat at tables like this, not the ones who cleaned them afterward. One of the investors, an older man with decades of experience written into the lines of his face, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism, but in recognition. That kind of work does not disappear overnight, he said slowly, almost to himself, as if piecing something together, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to tilt toward her, not physically, but in awareness, as if everyone was recalibrating their understanding of who she was, or rather, who she had been. Ji-hyun's gaze sharpened again, catching that shift, absorbing it, processing it, because this was no longer about a mistake in a financial model. It was about something far more rare, someone who had moved from one world into another without explanation, without announcement, without permission, and that alone made her impossible to ignore. Then why? Are you here? He asked, and this time, the question carried something different, not authority, not challenge, but something closer to curiosity, restrained, controlled, but real. The room held still once more, waiting, because this answer mattered in a way the others had not. It would complete the picture, close the gap. restore order, or break it further. Maya's fingers brushed lightly against the cloth in her hand, not out of nervousness, but habit, a small grounding motion. And when she spoke, her voice did not change. It did not rise. It did not harden. It remained exactly what it had been. From the beginning, steady, clear, unembellished, life changes, she said, and for a moment, it seemed too simple, too vague, as if she were avoiding the truth, but something in the way she said it, the absence of explanation, the lack of apology, made it impossible to dismiss because it did not ask for understanding, it did not invite sympathy, it simply existed. A quiet tension settled over the room again. Not sharp, not uncomfortable, but reflective, because now the story was not about numbers or mistakes. It was about assumptions, about the quiet arrogance that had filled the room earlier, about the ease with which they had all agreed on who she was without ever asking, without ever looking. Kang Ji-hyun exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his gaze never leaving hers, and in that moment, something within him shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but deeply, because he understood something now that he had not before, something that could not be undone by a simple correction or a passing acknowledgement. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier amusement, none of the detached control, only clarity. You saw the flaw before anyone else in this room, he said, not as praise, not as flattery, but as fact, and the weight of that statement settled over everyone present, because it forced them to confront a truth they could not avoid, that the person they had overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed had just proven herself to be the most aware among them. And in a room built on power, awareness was everything. No one interrupted him after he spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because anything said now would only reveal how quickly their certainty had crumbled. And in a room where reputation was currency, silence was often the safer investment. Kang Ji-hyun took another slow step, closing the last of the distance between himself and Mai. And for the first time that night, there was no invisible line separating them, no hierarchy reinforced by space or posture, only two people standing within the same frame of attention, and that alone shifted the atmosphere more than any words could. Awareness is rare, he continued, his voice even, measured, but carrying a quiet weight that made everyone listen more carefully than before. Most people in this room rely on systems, on reports, on what they are told to believe. His gaze moved briefly, sweeping across the gathered investors, executives, and advisors, not accusing, not mocking, but acknowledging a truth they all understood. You saw what was not written, he finished, returning his focus to her, and the statement lingered, not as praise, but as recognition. Mai did not respond immediately, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, as if the attention surrounding her had not altered anything within her, but the room. Notice the difference now, the absence of hesitation, the quiet certainty that did not seek approval, and that made it impossible to place her back into the role they had assigned her earlier. One of the younger executives shifted forward, unable to contain the tension any longer. If she saw it, why did no one else? He asked, his voice carrying more confusion than challenge. And the question hung in the air, not directed at anyone in particular, but echoing through every mind present. The senior analyst exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the table as he considered his answer. Because we were not looking for it, he said finally, his tone calm, reflective. We trusted the structure, assumed the inputs were correct, and stopped questioning the outcome. He glanced briefly toward Mai, then back at the screen. She did not assume, and that simple distinction settled heavily across the room. Because it exposed something deeper than a technical oversight, it revealed a habit, a pattern, a flaw in the way they all operated. Kang Ji-hyun absorbed this without comment, his expression unreadable, but his silence was no longer passive. It was active, deliberate, as if he were allowing the realization to take hold, to spread, to do its work without interference. Then, after a moment, he turned slightly, addressing the analyst once more. Run the corrected projection, he said, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. And within seconds, the numbers on the screen shifted, recalculated, adjusted to reflect the flaw that had been uncovered, and the result was immediate, undeniable, the projected profit narrowing, then flattening, then dipping just enough to transform what had seemed like a strong opportunity into something far less certain. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but present. The sound of professionals recalibrating their expectations in real time. And through it all, Mai remained still, her gaze no longer on the screen, but slightly lowered, not in submission, but in detachment, as if the outcome had already been resolved long before anyone else had seen it. Kang Ji-hyun watched her for a moment longer, and then, without raising his voice, without making a spectacle of it, he spoke again, his words directed to the room, but anchored in her presence. "This deal would have cost us more than money," he said. "It would have cost us trust in our own judgment." And the implication was clear, not just about the model, but about everything that happened in the last few minutes, about the assumptions made, the conclusions drawn, the quiet arrogance that had filled the space before being dismantled piece by piece. No one disagreed. No one attempted to redirect the conversation because there was nothing left to defend, and in that stillness, in that shared recognition, something settled into place, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently, because the balance of the room had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and Kang Jae-hyun, the man who controlled every outcome within these walls, stood at the center of it, fully aware that the most valuable insight of the night had not come from the experts, the reports, or the projections, but from the one person they had all failed to see. The numbers on the screen continued to glow, colder now, stripped of their earlier promise, and no one rushed to speak over them, because the truth, once revealed, had a way of quieting even the most confident voices. A man near the back adjusted his jacket, his earlier ease replaced by a careful stillness, while another leaned slightly toward his colleague, whispering something too soft to carry. Not gossip, not strategy, but recalibration, because the rules of the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Kang Jae-hyun let the silence settle completely, before moving again, not away from Mai, but around her, a slow, deliberate step that brought him to her side rather than in front of her, a subtle repositioning that did not go unnoticed, because in a space defined by hierarchy, where one stood mattered as much as what one said, and now he was no longer placing her beneath the attention of the room, but beside it. "We proceed differently," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner without rising. "Effective. Immediately, this deal is paused." There was no resistance, no objection, not because everyone agreed, but because no one had the ground to challenge him anymore, not after what had just been revealed. He turned his head slightly, his gaze moving once more across the faces in front of him, reading them, measuring them, and then, almost as an afterthought, though nothing he did was ever without intention, he added, "And from now on, assumptions are not to replace verification." The statement was simple, but it landed harder than any criticism because it did not target a single person. It addressed everyone equally and left no room for denial. Mai remained still, her posture unchanged, but something in the room now revolved around her in a way that had nothing to do with her position or her uniform. It was a tension, earned, undeniable, and yet she did not step into it, did not claim it. She simply existed within it, as she had from the beginning. One of the investors, the same older man who had spoken earlier, cleared his throat quietly, his eyes still fixed on her. "You said you used to build models like that," he began, his tone no longer dismissive, but careful, respectful in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to him. "At that level, you would have been well compensated." He did not finish the sentence, did not need to, because the implication was clear. People did not walk away from that world without reason. The question lingered again, not as pressure this time, but as genuine curiosity. And for a moment, it seemed as though I might not answer at all, that she might let the silence hold its shape and leave the room with its unanswered questions. But then she spoke, quietly, without looking at anyone in particular. "Compensation does not always mean stability," she said her. words measured, deliberate, and stability does not always mean peace. The room absorbed that slowly because it was not the kind of answer they were used to. It did not provide details, did not satisfy curiosity. It simply reframed the question itself. Kang Ji-hyun watched her as she spoke, and something in his expression shifted again, not outwardly, not in a way that others could easily read, but internally, as if a line he had drawn between value and position, between status and worth, had just been quietly erased. He turned fully toward her now, no longer dividing his attention between her and the room. And for a brief second, the two of them stood in a space that felt separate from everything else. The noise, the expectations, the silent judgments, all fading into the background. "You chose to leave," he said, not asking, but acknowledging because her words had already answered that part, and she gave a small nod. Nothing more, no explanation, no defense, just confirmation. The room did not move, did not interrupt, because something deeper than curiosity had taken hold now. Something closer to recognition, not of her past, but of their own limitations, their own blind spots, the ease with which they had mistaken appearance for ability. And in that stillness, Kang Ji-hyun made a decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same clarity he applied to every calculation that mattered. A decision shaped not by what she had been, but by what she had. Revealed in this room, in this moment, under pressure that would have broken most people. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that quiet certainty. From this point forward, he said each word precise, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. No one in this room will address her as if she does not belong here. The statement settled over the space like a final adjustment, a correction not of numbers, but of perspective, and no one challenged it, no one even considered it, because they all understood, in a way they had not before, that the balance had already changed, and nothing they said now could return it to what it had been. The statement did not echo. It did not need to, because its impact was immediate and absolute, settling into the room like a quiet law that no one had agreed to, but everyone understood. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it moved through posture, through eye contact, through the way people now held their silence. Not out of dismissal, but out of consideration. One of the executives who had laughed earlier straightened slightly, his gaze no longer sliding past Mai, as if she were part of the background, but pausing just for a moment, long enough to acknowledge her presence in a way that had not existed before. And still, she did not move, did not step forward or claim anything that had just been given. She remained exactly where she was, grounded, composed, as if nothing external had the power to redefine her. Kang Ji-hyun observed this carefully, not just her stillness, but the way the room adjusted around it, because respect that was forced never lasted, but respect that emerged from realization carried weight, and what he was witnessing now was not obedience, it was correction. He turned slightly toward the table, his attention shifting back to the business at hand, but something had changed in the way he carried that authority. It was no longer detached, no longer purely strategic. There was awareness in it now, a sharpened clarity that had been absent before. "We will review every model again," he said, his tone steady, leaving no space for interpretation, line by line, assumption by assumption. A few nods followed, not out of routine agreement, but out of genuine understanding of what that meant now, because no one in the room wanted to be the next person who overlooked something so fundamental. The senior analyst spoke quietly, almost respectfully. "I will lead the revision," and Ji-hyun gave a slight nod, acknowledging without elaborating, his focus already moving forward. But then, just as the momentum of the room began to shift back into its familiar rhythm, he paused, his gaze returning once more to Mai. And that pause alone was enough to halt everything again, because by now, everyone understood that when he stopped, it was never without purpose. "You will assist," he said, his voice calm, but unmistakably directed at her. And for the first time, a flicker of surprise moved through the room, not loud, not disruptive, but present, because this was no longer recognition. This was inclusion. Mai did not react immediately, not because she was unsure, but because the weight of that statement required a moment to settle, not in the room, but within herself. And when she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, there was no hesitation, only a quiet acknowledgement. "If that is what you need," she said, her tone unchanged, neither eager nor resistant, simply accepting the reality placed before her. A faint shift of expression crossed Ji-hyun's face, so brief it could have been missed, but it was there. A recognition that her response was not driven by opportunity, but by principle, and that distinction mattered more than anything else in that moment. One of the investors leaned slightly toward another, whispering under his breath, not mocking this time, but thoughtful. "She speaks like she never left," and the other gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Because it was true, nothing about her suggested someone trying to return to something lost. She spoke as if she had never stopped being who she was. The room, once filled with quiet arrogance, now carried a different kind of tension, one built not on hierarchy, but on awareness, on the understanding that value could exist where they had never thought to look, and that realization was not comfortable, but it was undeniable. Kang Ji-hyun took a final glance around the room, reading the shift, confirming it. And then, without raising his voice, without reclaiming the spotlight, he said, "We continue." And just like that, the meeting resumed. But nothing about it was the same, not the tone, not the attention, not the unspoken assumptions that had once defined it. Because now, at the edge of the table where she had once stood unnoticed, Mai was no longer invisible, and the room, whether it admitted it or not, had begun to revolve around the quiet certainty she carried without ever needing to claim it. The room moved forward, but it did not forget, not the numbers, not the silence, and certainly not the moment when everything shifted without warning. Voices returned, measured and controlled. Discussions resumed with a sharper edge, as if every word now carried the quiet awareness that certainty could no longer be taken for granted. And at the edge of the table, where she had once stood unnoticed, Mai now listened as the revised projections were debated, her presence no longer dismissed, but not yet fully understood, something in between, something that required time for the room to adjust to. The senior analyst worked through the updated model, his tone precise, his language careful. But there was a difference in the way he spoke now, a subtle pause before each conclusion, as if he were testing not just the numbers, but his own assumptions, and twice, without prompting, his eyes shifted briefly toward Mai. Not for approval, but for confirmation, a silent acknowledgement that her perspective had earned a place in the process. Kang Ji-hyun observed all of this without interruption, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, but the stillness around him carried a different kind of authority now. Not just control, but awareness, the kind that recalibrates rather than dominates. And when the final revision settled into place, the numbers no longer promising effortless gain, but reflecting a balanced, realistic outcome, he gave a slight nod, not to the analyst, not to the room, but almost imperceptibly toward her. "We proceed with caution," he said, his voice steady, and no one questioned it. Because caution, in this moment, felt like intelligence, not hesitation. The meeting began to close, chairs shifting quietly, glasses lifted and set down, conversations lowering into more private tones. But the atmosphere did not return to what it had been at the beginning of the night. It could not, because something fundamental had changed, something that did not announce itself but lingered in every interaction that followed. One by one, people passed near Mai as they moved through the room. And though none stopped to speak, their acknowledgement was visible in small, almost instinctive gestures, a glance held half a second longer, a nod that would not have existed before, subtle, but undeniable. She accepted none of it outwardly. Her posture remained the same, her movements as quiet and efficient as they had always been, as if nothing external had the power to alter her sense of self. And that, more than anything, held the room's attention. Kang Ji-hyun remained where he was until the last of the guests began to leave, his gaze following the gradual clearing of the space, the soft echo of footsteps against polished floors, the low hum of conversation fading into the distance. And only when the room had thinned to its final few figures did he move again, turning toward the place where Mai now stood near the table, resetting glasses, restoring order to a space that had just been redefined. He approached, without urgency, without ceremony, and stopped a few feet from her, not as a superior addressing staff, but as a man acknowledging something he could not ignore. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, but clear, and then he said, quietly, "You changed the outcome tonight. Not as praise, not as gratitude, but as fact." And she paused just briefly, her hands stilling against the glass she held, before she looked up at him once more. "The outcome was already there," she replied, her voice calm, unwavering. Someone just needed to see it, and the simplicity of her words settled into the space between them, carrying more weight than anything else that had been said that night. Ji-hyun held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave the slightest nod, not commanding, not conceding, but understanding, and as she returned to her work. As the final traces of the evening faded into quiet, one truth remained, unspoken but undeniable, that power had not shifted because it was taken or given or forced in a place, but because in a room built on certainty, one person had chosen to see clearly when no one else did, and in doing so, had reminded them all what dignity looks like.